I mean, I was thinking about this when you brought up that question, and I think I don't know if this is exactly the same thing, but I did an exercise actually when I was in grad school about it was a great exercise where they had Louise Hawes was the professor who gave us this exercise, and she had us write to pick an age and write like at a time in our lives when we really could have used this, and then write a letter to ourselves at that age saying what we think that younger version of us would have needed to hear at that time. And by the end of it, everybody was crying, and most of us had I mean, I write for all ages, but I would say there's sort of a well, at the time especially, I was working on middle grade, and like there was this like 12, 13-year-old self that I wrote a letter to, and most of us had chosen an age that we write for. And there was definitely this sense of like the things that we most needed to hear at that time in our lives was showing up in our work over and over again. And a lot of my stories, I mean, probably all of my stories are about either deep friendships or some sort of, I mean, they're all about deep friendships in some way, but this sense of like belonging and trust and people really seeing you and loving you for who you are, which I think is something I needed back then. And it's like a core thing that drives, I think, pretty much every story that I work on now. I mean, I'm not always thinking about it, but it's always in there every time.
You know, I feel like I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like there is this one thing that sort of connects all of the stories that I work on, and it's the idea, this idea that I loathe, which is dark or blackness as a negative, which is like, you know, used throughout literature. And it's just like, you know, what a sort of kind of shorthand, you know, dark days, that sort of thing, that people use all the time. And it is something that I'm always pushing back against just because of the societal repercussions of that kind of thinking. And so that has a lot to do with my approach to stories. So the Jumbie series, for example, it starts out with me having one society that literally lives in the darkness in the forest and one society that lives on the outside of it, and what happens when those two societies clash. I mean, it's also about indigenous cultures and stuff like that. There's a lot of, you know, layers, but it is at its core about being afraid of darkness and being afraid of what is in darkness. And so that's the entire series goes through all of that. And the nonfiction that I am currently working on that will come out next year is African Icons, and it is about African history, pre-colonial African history, because it is, again, just kind of part and parcel of the same kind of thinking that dark blackness is inherently bad or less than or whatever. And so I wanted to go back into like really ancient history, starting with the beginning of Egyptian society and thinking through, well, who were the great people? What did they do? How did they change the kind of things, the culture and the politics that happened on this entire continent before Europeans started coming in en masse and kind of, you know, inserting themselves into the culture and the politics and changing everything. Like, what did the continent look like before that? So I feel like that is always at the core of what I am thinking about with a story. Like, that's always the kernel of things. And then from there, it becomes, okay, well, it's this fantasy story, or it's this nonfiction story, or it's this science story, or it's this, you know, other thing. But that's always the seed. That's a good question, Sinan. I love that